All right, today we have a great episode all about winter gardening. Right now we're in the season, heading into winter. For some of you in a climate like myself here in the Central Valley of California, we are finally cooling off, but there's still so much to grow. And so today I have an incredible guest, Jill McSheehy from the site Journey with Jill. She also has the Beginner's Garden podcast, and she's going to give us some great winter gardening tips. She is in Arkansas, but just like us here in the Central Valley, she has very hot summers and fairly mild winters. So we're kind of similar in our growing climates. Jill, welcome to the Audrey's Little Farm Show.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Great. Well, for anyone who is not familiar with you, Jill, will you give us a quick introduction and what you do helping gardeners, and just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Jill McSheehy, and I live in the River Valley of Arkansas, Zone 8A, but we've been 7B forever. And I started gardening in 2013 when I became a stay-at-home mom, and my kids were 6 and 2 at the time. And I just decided to grow a garden because I wanted to help our family's grocery bill since I had just quit my job. And what I thought would be just a garden of frugality, of trying to just grow our own food, became something I loved to do. It became a lifestyle, one I can't imagine not doing. And because I didn't have a background in gardening and I really relied on a lot of other resources, but I wasn't able to find a lot of real basic resources. Most books expected you to have a little bit of knowledge, and I didn't even have that. Once I actually started having more of that knowledge, I wanted to teach others how to do it. So I've been gardening for 11 years now, learning every year like we all do, and hoping to help others be able to grow their own food too.
That's incredible. Would you say, as you think back to when you started your garden, what was that experience like, just starting from not having that experience gardening to getting started? Like, what helped you, I think, take that leap, and what helped you the most in the beginning?
I think for me, not knowing everything I didn't know was actually a blessing, because I think if I knew all that could go wrong or all that I would need to do, I think it would have overwhelmed me. But instead, I was just so green with it all. And I got a couple of books. My mom got me a book for Christmas. And that fall, knowing that I was going to have a garden, I just spent the winter reading and studying up on as much as I could. And I just tried to plan as well as I could. And let's just see how it goes. I think I just was very optimistic that if I just follow all the instructions, I would get everything I wanted. And of course, that's not always the case, but I got enough success where I wasn't discouraged, and I learned from the things that did come up that weren't so great. So I think just really going into it with being as prepared as I could be, but also being ready to adapt and also learning as I went.
Right. Would you agree that, especially for a beginner gardener, the best thing that you can do is just actually start growing, because you'll learn so much just by the experience of growing, even if it doesn't go well?
I think so. I think it helps to have a basic understanding of some things, just because from the people that I hear, that I listen to, if they've had a negative experience, they just chalk it up to, well, I just have a black thumb. I can't grow a garden like you can. But a lot of times, if I probe them a little bit more, it was a lack of basic information that made them plant at the wrong time, or plant the wrong type of plant for their climate, or not focus on their soil. And it's not because they have a black thumb. I don't believe in that. It's because they didn't have some basic information. But I feel like you're absolutely right in that, going into it knowing that in the course of the garden season, I'm going to learn, then keeping that open mind of, I'm going to learn. And a lot of that learning may be through failures, but at least I'm going to learn as I go, and just not expecting it to be either win or lose, but know that you'll have some wins, you'll have some failures, but then learning from that will help you become a better gardener.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for that. So in those first few years, I guess, it's like right now we're in winter, and the topic of this podcast is some winter gardening tips. So in those first few years of growing a garden, did you grow a winter or a fall and winter garden, or were you only spring, summer?
I was only spring, summer, and I'll never forget. I actually found this in my Facebook memories recently, and it was like, you're a rookie gardener when people are talking about winter gardening, and you're like, oh my goodness, like, what did I say? Like, are they talking about fall gardening? And you're like, is it winter yet? Because you just want to be done. I was exhausted. I had no thoughts of a fall or winter garden. And it took me a couple of years of just kind of getting my footing to be able to consider a fall and winter garden. But once I did, and once I learned how to do it semi-successfully, it's got its own little learning curve. I realized how enjoyable it was and how much less work it actually is. And I just really enjoy it a lot, and for so many reasons.
Right. I love the topic of fall and winter gardening. And I this whole entire fall and winter, anyone, or the fall, we're in the going into winter, anyone who's been listening to the podcast, I think every episode has been about fall gardening and winter gardening and the joy that it brings, how much easier it is. It's less watering, less work. But you're in a hot climate as well. And when summer ends, it's so exhausting. You want that break. But the fall and winter garden is so much less work. And there's so many things you can grow that I don't think people realize. So will you, now, fast forward, you are not a beginner gardener and you have this incredible garden. Will you walk us through what's growing in your fall garden and some of your favorite crops and maybe just in general tips just for fun?
Yeah, what I am growing all winter long, and the first time I did this was last winter, so that kind of tells you it took me 10 years to get to this point, but I grow greens all winter long. I do have the help of a greenhouse, but I was able to also grow it, most of it, even under cover outside. But I did have, the greenhouse to help with the quantity of the things that I grew. But as far as a fall garden, November going into December, I still usually have broccoli and cabbage. Those are the crops that I have. Typically, I have carrots. I had a carrot fail this year, which a recent podcast of mine talks about that. But typically, I have carrots going in the garden. But for me, the biggest thing over the winter is just as many greens as I can get, continuing to get lettuce over the winter. And some of the more hardy greens is what I like to grow the best.
I would agree. I love the leafy greens and just the continuous harvest. And, it's just especially when you think of buying a container of lettuce at the grocery store, first, just the price, but then the fact that it goes bad so quickly. And then when you can just go out into the garden and clip away, it's super nice.
And what's wonderful about the fall and winter garden in that regard is that growth slows so much, especially if you live in an area where you get decreased daylight. The lower amount of daylight you get, the slower the growth is, which I know on one hand seems sad because everything's growing at a snail's pace. But on the other hand, I don't have to hurry and rush and harvest my lettuce like I do in the spring before it bolts or gets too big because the growth is so rapid. Now it just kind of sits there waiting for me to be ready for it. And that's what's so enjoyable, literally feeling like I have my own grocery store outside because it's just continually available.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the fact of the slower growth because that's one of the things in the summertime that could be a really stressful thing for a lot of gardeners, especially if you work and have families, is that rush of having to harvest. Because if you are a little bit late, that zucchini went from being perfect to ginormous and, things go bad. And then you almost feel like it's a waste. And in the fall and the winter, like you said, things are just slower growing. So it's like a slower pace and you don't have to worry about crops bolting. A lot of times people want to grow lettuces and leafy greens in the warmer months, but they don't really grow very well. And then, like you said, you have to be out there as soon as you can to harvest before the crops bolt. And so if anyone listening has tried growing greens in the middle of spring, especially here when it might be cool, but then it's not rare to have a day that might be in the mid 90s, those crops just don't grow very well. So right now in the fall and winter is your perfect time to plant everything like that.
Yeah.
Do you plant, I guess, so like right now at the time of recording, we're in November. Are you still sowing your leafy greens out in the garden or at this point, are you growing in the greenhouse?
Both. So I am still sowing, even though I know they're going to grow really slow at this point because we dip below 10 hours of daylight at the end of November. So I know we're getting in our really lowest times of the year. So I will continue sowing, but a lot of the time, what I depend on those for is more of in January and February. I have lettuce that's probably 4 or 5 inches tall that I'm putting in the greenhouse and outside. That's pretty mature that I started inside my grow room to be able to last during the time of the low daylight. But when I'm sowing seeds this time of year, I'm really sowing them more for them to get established when it's not super cold yet in November, and then hopefully last through the cold part and then really take off when the days start getting longer later in January.
Okay. That's very similar to here because it just seems to always be that I'm pretty late getting a lot of things in the ground, but it's that same thing. It's like as long as you get them in the ground, they will just survive over our winter because we don't get snow. We'll get, we're basically in like the 30s and 40s, but then
Yeah.
occasionally we have some hard frost. But the crops, it's like not enough to kill off the crops. So then, like when the days start getting longer, like you said, then things take off again. So I always
Yeah.
try to encourage everyone, especially locally or in a similar climate to you. It's like even if you feel late, you can still get it in the ground and it'll take off later on.
Well, and I have found, and you probably found this too, that the younger they are, the more resilient they are to any cold snaps. If it's a mature, lettuce or spinach or arugula, I've had them die in cold snaps if they're really mature. But if they're at that adolescent stage, they're really resilient. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
actually ideal for overwintering and some of those borderline winter climates like mine.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, it's just crazy sometimes how hardy they are until you kind of forget about them and you go back out and you're like, oh my gosh, these just are like crazy hardy little vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned your grow room. Do you have a room in your house where you start all your seedlings with lights, or what is your grow room like?
I do. It's actually also called a playroom, but my kids are older. So my daughter does drums, so she still has a drum set in the corner, but the rest of it is my grow lights. I have one large 2 by 4 inch grow light with my husband built me a cabinet. And then I also have a wire shelf behind me that I can, and I've got grow lights on that if I need to. I typically will sow seeds in my greenhouse just because I keep all the dirt and the soil out there, but then I'll bring them into my grow room. And then whenever I can, I get them into the greenhouse just to maximize space in the grow room. But yeah, that's what my
Nice.
setup is.
Perfect. Are you growing a lot of, are you starting seedlings basically year round? Are you doing stuff all through the winter, or just depends on what you're wanting to grow?
I usually start in mid-January is usually when I'm starting my newest broccoli and cabbage for the spring. And then later in January, I'll start my earliest lettuce. I would say the last seeds that I start are typically September or so when I start my winter lettuce. And depending on if I do onions from seed indoors, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'll start those in December. But typically, I have this time right now, like during the fall, that I'm not starting a whole lot indoors. And sometimes this has been on my to-do list. I want to get started doing microgreens because I like having the microgreens to supplement. Since I have the grow light space available, I'll probably get those going pretty soon.
Nice. I always, right now our house is small. And so I sometimes will have the grow lights, but it's just like, they're right in the middle of the kitchen and I'm moving them like daily. And it's just a hassle right now, but we're hopefully sometime in the near future building a home. And I'm like, I can't wait to have an area where I can just have my grow light set up and I don't have to constantly be moving stuff. So that'll be in
It
the
is
future.
nice. I will say I like that it is in the hallway where we're constantly walking by it because I feel like if I didn't have it like very close, it would be harder to keep an eye on the seedlings, which is so necessary.
Right.
So I think that's helpful to not to have it. I guess if you do have to have it somewhere out of the way, just be really careful to look at it every day.
Right. Jill, what is your spring like? Because for us here, we can grow like basically all of our cool season crops in fall and through the winter, but we have kind of a hard time growing a lot of the stuff in late winter, early spring, because we tend to have a very warm spring, like very fast.
Mm.
So I was curious, what is your spring like? Just wondering, like, the weather, for someone who might not be here in the Central Valley, who's listening from far away.
Yeah, and that's a good question because I have found I actually had someone ask me this last week. She was talking about how we're in the same zone, but she gets cold so much faster than me and the cold stays much longer. And I said that's because, zone has to do with your low temperature in the winter. It doesn't dictate how quickly you get cold in the fall or how quickly you warm up in the spring. For us, I don't know, you said you get really warm springs quickly. We get really hot summers quickly. So
I guess that's probably the better way. That would be the better way to say it. We get our hot summer fast.
Yes. So it can be a challenge to grow cool season crops in the spring, especially if we have a winter that hangs on a little longer than usual, because a lot of times we may not, get our average last frost date is early April, but sometimes well into March we'll still be really cold. And then sometimes in middle of May, we shoot up to the 90s. And so when you have that short amount of time where you have the ideal temperature for most cool season crops, it can be challenging to make sure you plant them at the right time where it's not too cold ahead of, when you plant them, but then you get them to harvest before it gets too hot. That can be a little bit of a challenge.
Right. I would agree. So are you still growing most of yours? Are you still doing a second crop of basically everything in late winter, early spring? Like
A
I
second
guess not,
crop.
I guess not second crop. So if you have, did you just do broccoli for example, with broccoli, did you do broccoli in fall?
Yes.
Okay. And then have you already harvested your broccoli or is it still reaching
In
maturity?
progress. I
In
harvested
progress.
some last week and I still got some few heads coming. I've been able to, for some reason, I've planted different varieties with different days to maturity. And so they're kind of stair stepping, which was the goal. So I'm harvesting
Perfect.
them right now in November. But sometimes I harvest them all the way through December, just depending on how quickly we get cold.
Okay. And then will you grow? So I guess as I say, second crop, that might not be the correct term, but are you going to grow broccoli again in spring?
Yes. So
Okay.
the ideal time for me has been to sow my broccoli and cabbage seeds in the middle of January and then plant them outside at the beginning of March. And sometimes I'll plant them outside at the end of February if we're warmer earlier. But then if I get them in by the beginning of March, usually I'll be able to have a harvest in April, the
Okay.
end of April, before the heat comes and causes them to bolt.
Okay. Good to know. And I guess that's probably pretty similar for us. It's just like you said, it's like definitely that timing. So, getting them out in the garden before that heat really sets in, but then, making sure it's that ideal growing temperature. And then
Yeah.
these seeds, those are ones that you're starting indoors in your grow room.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So that's a good thing to know for anyone listening. If you've, missed your window for fall and winter, you still have time, but it would be one of those things where you need to get your seeds started in the winter, or hopefully sometimes our local nurseries will have the crops on time, but it just seems like they're always a little bit off where it's like we have a really good local nursery that I love going to, but they're not always, when you need to be planting, they don't always have those crops. So you kind
Yeah,
of have
I guess that's because of a consumer demand, because I've noticed the same thing. I'm like, okay, I'm glad they're here, but I planted those like 2 weeks ago.
right. And that's what I've noticed. It's like the timing is off. Or the thing I see a lot here locally is the stores will have, tomatoes and peppers in like February,
Yeah.
and people think it's ready time to plant. And then they have stunted plants all summer long because it's cold. It's still cold. It's not uncommon to like, we might have a random warm week in February. And then it's like suddenly the nurseries have these plants and then people plant and then it gets super cold and the plants just stay small. And
Yeah.
you definitely can't follow what's on the shelves at the store.
Yeah, that's my pet peeve when I see that in February. I'm like, no, all you're doing is you're making a bunch of money, because here it's not a matter of it getting cold. It's a matter of it's going to freeze again. So you're going to lose all your plants unless you,
Yeah.
have them in a greenhouse. So
Yeah.
basically they're getting 2 for 1 there.
Exactly. And it's also, then it's so much work. If you are the gardener that goes out and buys them, then you're going to be having to go out to the garden, cover up your plants with frost cloth. And it's very likely they're not
Yeah.
going to grow great anyways. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things I see, and always I'm trying to preach when that time of year comes, like, don't buy your plants yet. Just hold off.
Yeah. But I know for me, and it sounds like for you, I can't wait too long, because what you'll hear from a lot of people is don't get in a hurry. And that would be the case for a crop like peppers, for example, or sweet potatoes. But for tomatoes, it's really hard because we get so hot so fast that if I don't get a harvest before we get in the hottest part of the summer, then the tomatoes stop producing. And
Okay.
if you wait too late, then you won't get much of a tomato harvest. And I have local people that ask me that all the time. They're like, they're at the middle of July and they're like, why do I have no tomatoes? And I said, well, because it's too hot. Keep them alive and they'll come back. Like I have an amazing tomato set right now, because we've kind of had an Indian summer this year, so everything is still going well in November, surprisingly. But a lot of times, new gardeners don't understand why they're not getting tomatoes in the heat.
Yeah. And I would say, I think I know you guys have really high humidity, correct?
Mm-hmm.
We have basically no humidity at all. And I don't have any trouble with the tomatoes, even when it's 100 plus degrees. We'll
Wow.
get tomatoes all summer long. So that's the really great thing of here, even though our summers are horribly hot. I think our July, it was like over 110 the whole month of July, but I was still
And your
picking ripe
tomatoes still
tomatoes.
set?
Mm-hmm. I was
Wow.
still, tomatoes were still ripening. I was still picking tomatoes. There wasn't one, then I'm still having tomatoes still, even in November, they're still doing incredible. It's like you said, they're better now because it's like, now it's cooler, but even
Yeah.
in the crazy heat of summer, because I actually was a little bit late. We had a very cold spring this last spring, and I didn't even transplant my tomatoes until May 1st. And by June I was harvesting, and then all through July and August, no
Wow.
issue. So I think I think the humidity more than maybe the heat, just because we have really good success in the heat, but it's just that we have no humidity. So I
That's
think
really
that,
good to know. And that
yeah,
also is important for like just the local knowledge is so
yeah,
important.
yeah.
Yeah.
I love, that's what's really fun, talking to gardeners who, like you said, it's like we have very similarities in our climates, even though, being here in California, you're in Arkansas, and we're different zones, but we still have lots of things that are similar. But then there's those things that are very different, like the high
Yeah.
humidity, dry heat. And so, but I think it's probably more similar when it comes to the cool season crops. So,
Mm.
the stuff that you're growing in your fall garden, the same as here. And, we're not having to worry about planting before snow, because we don't get that snow. So it's just like more success throughout the fall and winter, which is really, really cool for
Yeah.
gardeners in more of a year round growing climate, because there's a lot to grow.
Yeah. And it's our reward for dealing with the summer.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Do you have my last crop I would love to hear about or the last crop I would love to hear about is, do you grow onions in both the fall and the spring? And if so, are you having success in both seasons, or just one or the other time of year?
I would say the precise answer to your questions is I just grow them in the spring, but last year for the first time I experimented with planting them in the fall along with the spring. So I planted short day onions in the fall, and the ones that made it, and they were the ones that were either in my greenhouse or I covered them well, they produced really large and they produced early. I got them in May, I think, which was the earliest I'd ever harvested onions. Usually it's June and July. But I've never actually grown them for bulbs in the fall. I don't know if you can do that or not, but I did plant them in the fall.
Yeah. I don't think they will produce. I think I want to say, I know I tend to not have. I feel like I'm always. So I guess so. I always plant them in the fall, and then we harvest in the spring. And a
Okay.
lot of the local gardeners here that I have connected with, they have the best success planting in the fall, harvesting in spring. And so then I just always skip that spring crop, because in my mind I was thinking it would get too hot to harvest
Mm.
if I planted them in spring. So when you grow them in spring, when are you normally planting?
I've experimented with that too. Most of the time, I will plant them in mid February,
Okay.
but I have experimented with planting them in April also, just to see what I might be able to get from that. And so, what I found from that, and let me go back to why people don't typically in my area plant them in the fall, is because from what the research that I've done, we are really close to being able to plant them in the fall or them dying over the winter. Like we're at the borderline. So people in southern
Right.
Arkansas are more likely to plant them in the fall. People in northern don't even try it, because from what I experienced with some of my uncovered onions is that they didn't all survive the winter if they were uncovered. But
Okay.
all that to say, the ones that I plant in mid-February are usually harvested in June and July, and they are good size. But then the ones that I planted in April, they were much smaller, but I got them later, so I was able to have a more of a succession type harvest. So that kind of worked out well. But my best harvest is usually the ones that I plant in mid-February.
Okay. Well, that just it's encouraging. I'm going to try my onions again, because I do that one fall crop, and I typically don't plant them again, just because I was thinking it would warm up too fast, and then maybe not, they wouldn't grow well. But I just normally
I
don't
have
even
not
test that one out.
I always thought the same thing that you said about thinking it would be too hot. I
Hmm.
have not found that to be a big issue with onions like I thought that it would be. I just
Okay.
haven't found them being bothered by the heat because,
Yeah.
like I said, a lot of times I'm harvesting them in July and it's still really hot and they don't seem to be bothered at that point. So I don't
Okay.
know. It's worth testing.
Yeah. No, it's like I always tell people to test out their planting dates, but then I will find myself, I'm like, there's lots of things that I don't test out, and that's the onions is one of them, which it's one of the things we use the most. I feel like we use onion in something daily, basically. And so it's one
Yeah.
of those crops where I would love to have them multiple times per year, where you have, versus growing so many at once and trying to store them away, you have them kind of spread out throughout the year. So that would be something I definitely need to test out.
That was my goal because I was tired of having to do all the chopping and freezing and dehydrating. And I'm like, if I could just get these longer, then that would be ideal.
Right. I love more than growing huge amounts of things and then trying to preserve it all at once. It's much funner, I feel like, in my experience, is just like having little bits all throughout the year of all the different crops versus having to grow that huge crop and store it away or preserve it somehow. Even though that's great, it's nicer to just go pick it out of the garden.
Yes, I have learned that the last few years for sure. It requires
Um,
a little bit more planning on the front end, but it's easier when the harvest starts coming on.
yeah. My son right now, he's 2. And since he's been born, it's just like the time I had for things does not exist anymore. So I'm like, I don't have time to be, and when all this, when these huge crops come on, I'm like, now I don't even have the time to preserve it. I don't know what to do. Like, and then you feel bad when it's going to waste. But
Yes.
I've always wanted to grow loads and loads of lots of different plants. And I'm like, I need to learn how to plant smaller quantities of different things spaced out better and have those smaller continuous harvests, not that huge like bumper crop, because I don't have time to harvest and preserve it right now.
Yes. Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah. So Jill, I know we don't have to go very in depth to this because for anyone listening, Jill is going to be one of the speakers at the upcoming Spring Gardening Summit. And depending on when you're listening, registration may or may not be open if you're listening to this at a later date. However, there is a wait list, and that wait list will automatically redirect you to the ticket when it's available. And Jill's going to be talking all about growing in the green stock planter. So I'm going to have her go over just a couple of tips in case you're not familiar with what this is. But if you really want to learn more about this really great planter, that is her entire talk at the summit. So Jill, will you just tell us what the green stock is, give us a few tips, and then we're going to leave them hanging so they can learn more at the summit.
Yeah, the Greenstock vertical planter is a vertical garden, container garden, and you can grow so many different things in it. And my favorite part about it is that it's virtually no maintenance. Once you start planting, you really don't have to do a whole lot with it. Pests are very minimal, weeds are very minimal, or if any weeds, really. You don't have to weed a whole lot at all, but you're able to get a lot of the same harvest that you would in a regular raised bed or a ground bed, but with less work. And then because it's a planter, most of the time you're going to have it right outside your door, so it makes it easy to go harvest. A lot of times, like when we get off this interview, I'm going to go outside and cut my greens from my green stalk and have lunch. So it's just really convenient, and it's a great way. I encourage even my friends who don't want to grow a garden but want some fresh food. I'm like, you've got to get one of these, and many of them have, and they've loved it. It's a great way to be introduced into gardening.
Nice. I love that. So yeah, anyone who's listening, even if you're familiar with it, it's still going to be a great presentation. I know after doing the interview with Jill talking about the green stock, I now am encouraged to go get my own. So sign up for the summit. The wait list will be below. And like I said, if you're listening at a later date and tickets are ready to grab, that will just redirect you to that page. And along with Jill, we have 15 plus other great gardening experts joining us. So it's definitely an event you guys don't want to miss. Jill, will you please tell everyone where they can go learn more and connect with you if they're ready to learn more from you?
Yeah, well, if you're listening to this and you are a podcast listener, you would probably enjoy my podcast, The Beginner's Garden Podcast. I'm on YouTube and on wherever you listen to podcasts. And then for written articles, you can go to journeywithjill.net.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of your tips today. For anyone listening, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next episode.